I still keep the letters in a wooden box, worn, splintered, marked with old mud and dry blood. They sit quietly at the back of my closet, wrapped in a faded red ribbon that used to shine like hope, now dulled by time and silence. I carried them through the jungles of Vietnam, each one folded carefully in plastic, tucked inside my uniform, pressed close to my chest, closer than my dog tags, closer than my weapon. She was called Aniela. I met her in Chicago, in our little Polish-American neighborhood, where Sundays smelled like incense and buttered pierogi, and where old men spoke English with heavy accents and remembered wars they didn't want to remember. She had hands that listened before her lips spoke, and eyes that saw more than they were supposed to. She gave me the first letter the day I shipped out, slipped it into my hand like a secret blessing. A few words, just enough to break me open. Then they started coming every week. Even in the chaos of Da Nang, with gunfire echoing through the trees and steam rising from the ground like ghosts, her words found me. Somehow the army mail system worked just enough. Her letters were never dramatic, never desperate. They spoke of snow in Chicago, her mother's little deli on the corner, the neighbor's barking dog. But between the lines, there was always a heartbeat. "I'm waiting," she'd write. "I'm waiting like spring waits for thaw." That voice, the softness of it, became the only melody I knew. My buddies teased me for it. Said no girl waits for anyone through a war. But they didn't know Aniela. She was different, and those letters, they were my tether to something human, something warm, a home. But then, they stopped. No warning, no goodbye. Just silence. A silence that settled in my gut like a second war. No more envelopes, no more scent of ink and perfume. Just empty hands. And with the letters, her voice vanished too. Why did she stop writing? Did something happen? Did she give up? Did I take too long? Years passed, but the silence stayed loud, and every time it rained, I could almost hear her voice again, like a song in another room. If this story moves you the way it moved me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that inspire, haunt, and stay with you. And now, brace yourself. What comes next changes everything. Every day in the jungle started the same, with sweat clinging to my back before the sun even crested the trees, the thick air heavy enough to choke. The heat was the kind that pressed down on you, not just on your body but your mind, until you forgot what your own skin felt like, without dirt. But even in that stifling, God-forsaken place, I had a ritual. Every morning, before roll call, before the patrols, before the fear crept back into my chest, I checked to see if there was mail. Mail call in Vietnam was chaos and silence at the same time. A couple of names shouted into the air, and 20 men listening with the hope of hearing theirs. You learn to recognize the rhythm of your own name, the way it sounds when said by someone else. When I heard mine, I'd drop everything. Because sometimes there'd be an envelope, slim, familiar, always with her handwriting, always with that quiet promise inside. Aniela's letters didn't talk about love. Not exactly. They talked about weather in Chicago, her mother's stubbornness, a dog she rescued from an alley. She wrote about the broken heater in their apartment and how the pipes groaned like ghosts in winter. But between those lines was something else, a kind of waiting, a kind of faith. "I think about you," she wrote once, "like Lake Michigan waits for the ice to break." Simple words, but they hit harder than any bullet. There's a strange thing that happens when someone writes to you consistently in war. They start living inside you. I could hear her voice in the rhythms of my day, see her face when I closed my eyes. My buddies would laugh, call me the poet, say I was clinging to a ghost. "You think she's not moving on?" one guy said. "Back home, girls don't wait, man. Not for this, not for us." But I didn't believe them, because she never wrote out of obligation. Her words felt like they came from a place untouched by the war. That's what made them sacred. They weren't trying to fix me. They were reminding me I hadn't been broken before. There were days I didn't get a letter, and it was like the air thinned. I'd reread the old ones, folded neatly, still carrying her scent, faint but there, like a perfume you only notice when it's gone. I knew them by heart. The loop of her bes oui, the way she signed off with just her first name, as if no other Aniela could possibly matter. Sometimes I tried to write back with honesty, to tell her what it was really like. The mud that never came off your skin, the fear that sat in your stomach like metal, the kids with eyes too old for their faces. But I always stopped, because I didn't want my words to carry that weight. I didn't want to drag her into this, so I wrote about the birds that flew low at dusk, and the boys who made guitars from trash, and how even here, once in a while, the sky was so clear it felt like a lie. I told her I was okay, because in the moment I wrote it with her name on the page, I almost believed it. I started keeping her letters in a waterproof pouch I wore under my shirt, closer than my cigarettes, closer than my maps. I slept with them, carried them through the bush. One time during an ambush, I remember thinking, if I die, let it be with her words touching my chest. There's a kind of hope that turns into ritual, and that ritual becomes survival. Her letters weren't just paper. They were proof that I existed to someone, somewhere, that there was a world beyond the jungle. That home wasn't just a word we used to hurt less. And in that hope, I waited for the next letter like a man waits for breath. I remember the last letter the way you remember a fever dream, hazy at the edges, but burning at the center. It arrived in November 1968, tucked between a package of socks from my mother and a field report none of us cared to read. The rain hadn't stopped for days. Everything was soaked, our boots, our tents, our skin. And I remember holding that letter under the shelter flap, trying to keep it dry, knowing somehow, though I couldn't explain it, that something was different. Her handwriting was the same. The paper smelled faintly of home, of her, but the tone had changed. She wrote about a fight with her father, how things had become tense in the apartment, how she missed even my silences, those quiet stares she used to roll her eyes at when I didn't know what to say. She asked questions, so many questions, as if searching for something solid to hold on to. Do you still carry the first letter? Do you still think about that Polish festival we went to, where you ate too much sausage and fell asleep on the grass? Do you ever dream of snow? She ended it with a single line that haunted me more than any ambush or landmine. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one still waiting. I wrote back the same night, poured everything I could into it, folded the paper with care, sealed it, and handed it to the mail sergeant with fingers that trembled more than I wanted to admit. I waited and wrote again and again, but nothing came back. At first I told myself it was just a delay, that mail got lost, that her family moved, that maybe her father had intercepted it, or she was sick, or she didn't know what to say. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into silence, thick, heavy silence, the kind that doesn't feel like absence, but like a wall that wasn't there before. I began to dread mail call, not because I didn't want her letter, but because I couldn't stand the feeling of not finding it again. I kept checking, even after everyone else had stopped watching me. I clung to hope long after it had started to rot inside me. There's something cruel about unanswered letters. It's not just the lack of words, it's the lack of a voice, of breath, of proof. It's like shouting into the void and hearing nothing but your own echo. I started dreaming about her, vivid dreams where she walked toward me across the field behind her church, holding a pie in one hand and a letter in the other. But when I tried to reach her, she always faded before I could touch her. Always. Eventually, I stopped writing, not because I stopped caring, but because I didn't know who I was writing to anymore. Her absence had shape by then, a shape that lived beside me, slept in my bunk, followed me on patrol. I wasn't alone, but I wasn't whole either. I carried her last letter in the same pouch with the others, but I never unfolded it again. I couldn't. I was afraid the ink would disappear the moment I read it twice. The guys in my unit stopped asking. They knew something had shifted. One of them, Ramirez from Boston, has said, "Some ghosts don't wait for you, man. Some move on. You gotta let them." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to respond to the truth. I started looking for answers in places that didn't offer them, in the way the clouds moved, in the hush after a firefight, in the faces of women I passed in villages. I wasn't looking for Aniela, not really. I was looking for the part of me that had stopped receiving letters, the part that was going silent too. By the time we pulled out in 1970, I had already memorized her silence. It had become my soundtrack. I didn't need her letters anymore to hear her voice, because absence, when it stays long enough, begins to sound like presence. And that's what terrified me most. I came home in the fall of 1970. The leaves in Chicago were starting to turn, yellow and red and brittle, falling onto sidewalks like forgotten notes. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and the sharpness of the coming cold. A kind of cold I'd almost forgotten existed. For the first few days, it felt like I was watching my own life from outside, like someone had picked up my memories and painted over them in slightly different colors. People welcomed me with awkward smiles, with claps on the back that landed too hard, with empty, "Thank you for your service," that tried to stitch over years they could never imagine. I nodded, smiled, said I was fine. But I wasn't carrying just a duffel bag and a uniform. I was carrying a silence, one that had settled into my ribs and wrapped itself around my lungs. Before I visited my parents, before I even unpacked my bag, I went to her house. It was still there, the same two-story brick place with the porch swing that used to squeak when she sat on it barefoot in the summer, drinking lemonade and waving me down the block. The paint on the shutters had faded. The garden was overgrown, but the windows looked the same, like eyes that refused to blink. I knocked. Her mother opened the door. I recognized her instantly, though she looked older, not just in years, but in spirit. Her eyes were grayer than I remembered, and when they met mine, something in them flickered, surprise, recognition, maybe even guilt. She didn't invite me in. She just stood there, one hand still on the doorknob, like she wasn't sure if I was real. "She's not here," she said, after a long pause. "She left a while ago." I asked where. I asked if she was okay, if there was someone else, if she ever talked about me. Her mother didn't answer right away. She just disappeared down the hall, and when she returned, she handed me a small envelope, unmailed, slightly yellowed with my name on it in Aniela's handwriting. She didn't say a word, just placed it in my hand and closed the door. I sat on the old bench in the church park, the one where Aniela and I used to sneak pastries after Sunday Mass, and opened the letter with the care of a man holding something sacred. There were only a few lines. "Sometimes war doesn't kill the ones who leave. It kills the ones who stay behind and wait." No signature, no date, just those words. I read them once, then again. And then I couldn't anymore. I folded the letter, placed it with the others, the ones she had sent from the beginning, and walked home with the kind of emptiness that didn't cry, didn't scream, it just existed, like a second skin. I returned to my apartment, went through the motions, got a job, spoke to neighbors, smiled when I had to. People said I looked good for a guy who'd been through it, but they didn't know what I hadn't come back with. That it wasn't just limbs or years I'd lost, it was answers. It was the end of a sentence that had been cut off in the middle. Sometimes I'd walk by her house again, just to see if anything had changed. If maybe a curtain moved or a light flickered or the porch swing creaked with someone sitting quietly waiting. But it never did. Eventually I stopped walking that way, not because I stopped caring, but because even hope starts to feel heavy when you carry it alone. The years slipped by quietly, not like a river, but like dust gathering in corners you forget to sweep. At first, I searched with urgency, like I believed she could be just around the corner, listed in a phone book, working behind a counter, singing in a church choir. I checked Polish community bulletins, thumbed through newspapers, asked around at church gatherings. I even wrote once to a local radio show that helped reunite people, but nothing ever came back. I began looking for her in crowds, not consciously, not every day, but often enough that it became a habit. The back of a head in a grocery store, a voice behind me at the post office, a laugh on the bus that made my breath catch in my throat. I knew deep down that it wasn't her, that she was gone or moved on or simply didn't want to be found. But still, I looked. Because hope doesn't die all at once. It dies in inches. Sometimes I imagined she had gone back to Poland, to her grandparents' village, where the air was still clean and the roads were lined with birch trees. I pictured her living in a small house, with lace curtains and a garden full of tomatoes, reading books by the window, humming songs her mother taught her. And maybe, just maybe, someone there loved her better than I ever could. Other days, I imagined she stayed in Chicago, just a few blocks away, living under a new name, married, raising kids who had her eyes. And maybe she still thought of me. Maybe, once a year, she'd open a drawer and find one of my letters. Maybe she'd touch it, then put it back, like it was a dream she didn't want to fully remember. There were times I nearly convinced myself to stop looking. But then I'd hear a song from that summer before the war, or find an old movie ticket stub from the theater where we used to sneak in, and it would all come rushing back. Not just her, but the version of me that existed when I believed in her. I never married. I dated briefly, but nothing ever stayed. People said I was kind but distant, like I was always waiting for someone else to walk through the door. They weren't wrong. The letters aged with me. The ink faded, the paper yellowed. Some of them tore at the folds, but I never threw any away. I kept them in that same box, the one with the worn corners and the faint smell of cedar, and once a year I opened it, always on the same day, the day I returned from Vietnam. I'd sit at my kitchen table, pour myself a cup of black coffee, and read the very first letter, the one she gave me at the bus station, the one that started it all. "If you come back," she wrote, "I want you to know I've waited for you before, and I'll wait again." She never wrote again after that last one, never spoke another word to me. But I still hear her voice in the spaces between things. In the rain, tapping against the window, in the quiet after a record ends, in the hush before sleep. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't need reminders. It lives inside the ordinary. And the strangest thing is, I never really hated the silence, because at least it was hers. Today, the letters rest in the same wooden box, its hinges creaky, its corners chipped, the grain darkened with time and the oils of my fingers after all these years. It sits at the back of my closet, under a folded American flag, next to a worn copy of a prayer book I haven't opened in decades. I never added anything to it. No photographs, no souvenirs, just the letters, just her words. They've aged with me. Some are too fragile to unfold without tearing. The ink is faint in places, but I know every word by heart. I don't need to read them anymore. I hear them, every pause, every curve of her pen, every phrase that once made me feel like I was still someone worth waiting for. I still read one letter a year, always the first. I open it on the same day I stepped off that plane back in '70. I sit at the table, pour black coffee into a chipped mug, and lay it flat on the surface like it deserves the quiet. "If you come back," it says, "I want you to know I've waited before, and I'll wait again." She never wrote again. I never heard her voice again. But in some strange, impossible way, she never really left me. She became the stillness in my mornings, the breath I hold when the wind rustles the trees just so, the ache that isn't pain, but memory. People ask if I ever found her. If I ever got closure, I tell them no and yes, because maybe closure isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you accept, a door that doesn't need to close to let you move on. Aniela was a part of me, is a part of me. Not just in memory, but in the way I learned to listen to silence, to hold space for absence, to live with questions and still find meaning. War took many things from me. Some I saw. Friends, time, innocence. Others were quieter, like letters that stopped coming, like the voice I still sometimes think I hear when I fall asleep. But it also gave me something I didn't expect. It gave me her, even if only for a while, even if only through words, and that I've come to believe was enough. We have new videos every day, true stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. See you in the next one.